Daniel Reeves never thought that something as simple as a porch could hold so much weight in his life. But when he finally finished building it, standing there in the soft evening light, he realized that the wooden structure attached to the front of his modest house was not just another home improvement project. It was the embodiment of a long-awaited sense of peace that had eluded him for years. After serving 12 years as a military engineer overseas, constantly surrounded by conflict, unstable environments, and the feeling that each day might collapse under the strain of hidden dangers, he had returned to the United States with the quiet determination to carve out a life defined not by chaos, but by stability, order, and permanence. The Porch had been funded through a special grant for veterans, one of those programs that rarely made headlines but that promised those who had served a chance to rebuild something tangible in their civilian lives. And Daniel had chosen to use those funds not on something fleeting or indulgent, but on a project that would root him, that would symbolize the solid foundation he wanted to build for the future. The house itself was not remarkable to anyone else. A one-story home at the edge of a tree-lined street in a quiet neighborhood where lawns were trimmed neatly and mailboxes all looked the same. But to Daniel, who had seen places where buildings collapsed overnight and families were left in ruins, it was a fortress of quiet dignity. Every nail hammered into the porch, every measured cut of the timber, was a statement against the uncertainty of his past. And as he sat on the newly installed steps, hands resting on the smooth railing, he allowed himself the rare luxury of breathing without tension in his shoulders. The porch was wide enough to hold a couple of chairs, a place where he could drink coffee in the mornings and watch the sun lift itself over the rooftops, or where he could sit in the evenings when shadows stretched long and the world slowed down. For him, it wasn't about aesthetics or impressing neighbors. It was about having a threshold that belonged entirely to him, a place to cross each day with a sense of ownership over his life. His neighbors had noticed the construction, of course. In a community bound by the ever-present oversight of the Homeowners Association, few things went unremarked, yet most had seemed indifferent, some even offering polite nods when they saw him working on weekends with a tool belt strapped around his waist. Daniel, who had never been the kind of man to seek approval, kept his distance, exchanging only brief greetings, but in his own mind he imagined that perhaps they understood, or at least respected, what the porch meant. There was, after all, a small plaque affixed discreetly to one of the beams, the emblem of the Veterans Support Initiative stamped into the metal. And though Daniel hadn't intended it to be seen as a declaration, it was his quiet reminder that this wasn't charity, it was recognition of service. At night, when the cicadas filled the air with their mechanical rhythm, he often sat on the porch with a glass of water in hand, staring out at the calm street. The glow of porch lights from neighboring houses flickered against the trees, and the smell of cut grass lingered in the air. He told himself that if his years overseas had taught him anything, it was to appreciate the simplicity of such moments. There had been times when the sound of footsteps on gravel had meant danger, when the creak of wood could signal a trap. But here, each sound was harmless, and each creak of his newly built porch floorboards reassured him that the structure was strong, that it would hold. The porch had become a quiet ritual. Mornings began with its boards cool under his bare feet as he collected the paper. Evenings ended with him leaning on its railing as he let the day's worries bleed into the stillness of the suburban night. And yet, even as he embraced this newfound calm, there was an unspoken awareness, almost instinctual, that peace was a fragile thing, that in neighborhoods ruled by rules and appearances, even something as simple as a porch could be challenged. Daniel dismissed the thought most nights, telling himself he had followed every regulation, secured every permit, checked every requirement twice before building. He had the county's approval stamped on official letterhead, the veterans grant contract safely stored in a folder in his desk, and receipts from the licensed contractors he had hired to ensure that no one could ever say it was unprofessional work. Still, a faint shadow of suspicion lingered, the soldier's instinct to anticipate threats before they arrived. For now, however, as the late summer air wrapped the neighborhood in its warmth, Daniel allowed himself to believe that this chapter of his life was different, that this porch was not only an entrance to his house, but the gateway to a new existence, where battles were fought not with weapons and tactics, but with patience and routine, and where his service had finally bought him the right to sit in peace on a structure built with his own two hands, funded by the acknowledgement of a country that had once demanded so much from him. It began on a morning that seemed no different from any other, when the air was already warm before the sun had risen fully, and the sprinklers down the street ticked rhythmically as if the entire neighborhood was locked in the same monotonous cycle of order and control. But for Daniel Reeves, the routine fractured the moment he opened his mailbox and found an envelope that did not look like the usual advertisements or bills. It was thick, with his name printed in precise block letters, and in the corner the logo of the Homeowners Association was stamped in dark ink, almost smug in its official permanence. He carried it back to the house with a faint unease, sat down at his kitchen table, and slid it open with the same slow deliberation he used when disassembling a piece of military equipment, knowing instinctively that whatever was inside was going to demand his full attention. The letter was formal, couched in legal phrasing that felt intentionally suffocating, and it declared that his porch had been erected without the necessary architectural approval of the HOA's Design Review Committee. According to their records, which were described as binding and final, the structure violated community standards for uniformity and was deemed a non-compliant addition to the property. The language was cold, detached, yet behind the bureaucratic tone there was an edge of threat, because the letter did not merely ask him to provide clarification or submit retroactive documents. It demanded that he remove the entire structure within 30 days or face escalating fines and legal action. The porch, the same one that had been carefully designed with permits signed off by the county, paid for with federal veterans' funds, and constructed with all the attention to safety and detail he had learned over years in the field, was being reduced on paper to an unauthorized blemish that had no right to exist. At first, Daniel thought it had to be a mistake, some clerical error born out of the HOA's notorious incompetence. He had, after all, filed every piece of paperwork in duplicate, kept copies of approvals, even sent notification to the HOA itself when the work began, not because it was required by law, but because he wanted no disputes about transparency. He leaned back in his chair, rereading the letter slowly, noting the phrases that stood out like blades. Unauthorized construction, mandatory removal, penalties escalating to legal enforcement. His pulse quickened not from fear, but from the insult embedded in those words, the implication that his porch was nothing more than a rebellious act, that his service, his grant, and his diligence were irrelevant in the face of a committee more concerned with appearances than truth. He picked up the phone and called the number at the bottom of the letter, waiting through the mechanical loops of hold music until a voice answered, sharp and efficient, identifying herself as the administrative coordinator for the HOA. Daniel explained calmly at first that he had all the required approvals from the county, that the porch was funded through a federal veteran program, and that the HOA must have made an error in their assessment. The woman's response was unnervingly rehearsed, as though she had repeated the same words countless times to other residents. According to their records, there was no approval, and therefore the violation was valid. When Daniel pressed, asking how their records could contradict county permits, she grew colder, reminding him that HOA bylaws superseded individual claims of compliance and that failure to act within the deadline would result in fines automatically attached to his property. By the time the call ended, Daniel's hands were gripping the receiver so tightly that his knuckles whitened, and the old sensation of being cornered began to creep back into his body. That same heaviness in the chest he remembered from nights. Overseas, when orders were handed down without explanation, and men were expected to obey without question. He stood up abruptly, walked outside and stood on the porch itself, staring at it as though it were suddenly fragile, as though the words on that piece of paper had the power to strip away the solidity of the beams and boards. Neighbors passed by on their morning walks, offering casual nods, oblivious to the storm brewing in the letter he held behind his back, and he wondered if any of them had ever faced this kind of pressure from the HOA, if they would understand what it meant to have something you had built with your own hands declared invalid by people who had never lifted a hammer. The rest of the day he spent combing through his files, pulling out manila folders from the drawer in his study, spreading them across the desk like pieces of a battlefield map. There was the permit signed by the county building inspector, the receipts from the contractor who poured the foundation, the official letter from the Veteran Grant Program acknowledging the completion of the project and authorizing the disbursement of funds. Each document carried weight, authority, and signatures that should have silenced any opposition, yet in the eyes of the HOA they were invisible, erased by a claim of missing paperwork in their private archive. The more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't simply an error, because an error could be corrected with a phone call or a copy of a permit. This was something else, something deliberate. A declaration of dominance that told him his porch existed only at the pleasure of the HOA, and they had decided to revoke that permission. That night, sleep did not come easily. He sat on the porch in the darkness, the letter folded in his pocket, the wood beneath him feeling heavier than usual, as though the weight of the notice had sunk into the structure itself. He looked down the street at the uniform facades of the other houses, identical porches and railings that fit neatly into the association's approved design standards, and he wondered if Mason Holt, the HOA president, had singled him out, intentionally, or if this was simply how the machine of neighborhood control operated, grinding down anyone who dared to build something with meaning. The veteran's plaque glinted faintly under the porch light, a small piece of metal that seemed suddenly vulnerable, and he felt a surge of anger rising in him because the HOA wasn't just asking him to dismantle wooden nails, they were demanding that he tear down a symbol of his service, his stability, his attempt at belonging in a civilian life that had already taken so much effort to rebuild. As the hours passed and the night deepened, Daniel came to a realization that chilled him. This was only the opening move. The letter was the first shot across the bow, and if he didn't respond with more than simple compliance or half-hearted appeals, they would press harder, escalate, and try to break him piece by piece until the porch was gone and he was left standing in the dirt. For the first time since leaving the military, Daniel felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct that told him he was stepping into another conflict, not of his choosing, but one he could not walk away from. And the battlefield this time was his own front yard. The following week, Daniel made the decision to confront the matter directly, believing that if he simply showed the HOA the stack of documents he possessed, the issue could be resolved. But as he prepared for the meeting scheduled at the association's small office near the town center, a part of him sensed that the situation had already slipped beyond simple misunderstandings. The office itself was located in a nondescript brick building sandwiched between a dry cleaner and an insurance agency. Yet as Daniel entered, the sterile fluorescent lights and the faint smell of carpet glue carried the weight of authority, designed to make residents feel small before the board's bureaucratic machinery. The receptionist, a woman with clipped speech and an expression of permanent irritation, barely looked up when he explained that he had received a violation letter regarding his porch. She directed him toward a waiting area where pamphlets about community integrity and uniform design standards lay neatly arranged on a table, each one filled with carefully chosen photographs of identical houses that seemed to erase any sense of individuality. When Mason Holt finally appeared, the HOA president greeted him with the kind of smile that was less welcome and more performance, his handshake firm but perfunctory, his tailored suit suggesting a man who believed that appearances conferred legitimacy. Daniel followed him into a small conference room where the blinds were drawn tightly against the midday sun, creating an atmosphere that was less meeting space and more interrogation chamber. On the table lay a file folder with Daniel's name typed across the tab in sharp black letters, and Mason tapped it casually as if it contained the entire truth of the matter. Daniel began by explaining calmly, though firmly, that he had every permit required, including county approval, federal grant documentation, and contractor receipts. He slid the papers across the table, each one a tangible rebuttal to the accusations in the violation notice. Mason leafed through them with the detachment of someone skimming a magazine in a doctor's waiting room, nodding slightly but never allowing the papers to interrupt the controlled rhythm of his movements. When he finally spoke, his words were laced with condescension. According to the HOA's records, he explained, the property had never received design approval for the porch, and therefore the structure remained in violation regardless of any external permits Daniel may have obtained. He pulled out his own set of documents from the folder, crisp copies of what he claimed were official association records, and slid them across the table with the same smoothness of a poker player laying down a winning hand. Daniel picked up the top page and felt his chest tighten. It was an architectural compliance report, stamped with a date and signed by someone identified as the former neighborhood inspector, stating clearly that no porch addition had been submitted for review on his property. At first glance it looked authentic, complete with seals and the signature of an official whose name Daniel vaguely recognized, but something about the document unsettled him, as though the ink itself carried a falseness that his trained eye, accustomed to analyzing details under pressure, could not ignore. He pointed out that county approval should override any HOA claim, but Mason's expression did not waver. He spoke of bylaws, of clauses buried in pages of regulations that allowed the HOA to reject any addition inconsistent with neighborhood standards, and he reminded Daniel, with the smooth authority of someone who had recited the same justification countless times, that membership in the community meant abiding by collective decisions rather than individual interpretations of legality. The implication was clear. It did not matter what Daniel had in his folder because the HOA's folder held more weight. As Mason leaned back in his chair, folding his hands with practiced ease, Daniel felt the same sensation he remembered from years ago when dealing with commanders who hid behind clipped orders, men who knew they did not need to justify their reasoning because power itself was its own justification. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been resolved. Mason repeated that the porch must be removed, though he offered Daniel a faintly patronizing grace period of 2 additional weeks if he wished to avoid legal escalation. As Daniel gathered his documents, he caught sight of a detail that stuck with him. The signature on the compliance report was dated several months after the inspector had retired, something he remembered reading in a local bulletin at the time. When he mentioned this inconsistency, Mason's smile faltered for the briefest second before returning with icy precision, and he dismissed it with the explanation that records are updated retroactively for continuity. It was the kind of explanation designed to shut down further questioning, but to Daniel it was confirmation that something darker was at work. Walking out of the office into the harsh afternoon sunlight, Daniel carried not only the weight of the documents in his briefcase but the heavier realization that he was facing a system designed to break down resistance through layers of manufactured authority. His porch, the project that represented stability and belonging, had been transformed into a battlefield where the enemy wielded paper and ink instead of weapons. Yet the tactics were familiar. Control the narrative, deny the legitimacy of opposition, and grind down the will to fight. As he drove back through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, past houses that looked suddenly more uniform, more complicit, he felt the stirrings of anger sharpen into resolve. If the HOA wanted to erase his porch through fabricated records and smug authority, they would discover that Daniel Reeves was not the kind of man who surrendered quietly, and though he did not yet know how deep their fabrication went, he knew this was only the beginning of a conflict that would demand every ounce of endurance he had carried home from war. The days that followed the confrontation in the HOA office stretched into a haze of frustration and suspicion. For even though Daniel had walked out with his documents intact and the conviction that Mason Holt was hiding behind falsified records, the weight of the association's authority pressed down on him in a way that could not be ignored, because every letter that arrived in his mailbox, every slip of paper stamped with the HOA's logo, carried the implied threat that no matter what he believed to be true, they had the power to define reality. He began each morning by checking the porch, running his hand across the railing, not because he doubted the craftsmanship, but because he feared that one day he would wake to find it marked with spray paint, or flagged with tape like a condemned structure, a ritual that reminded him of patrols in hostile terrain where the first thing a soldier did was verify the perimeter. The neighbors, who had once nodded to him casually, now seemed more reserved, their greetings clipped, their eyes flicking toward the porch before retreating, and Daniel wondered whether Mason had already begun whispering about him at board meetings, painting him as the veteran who refused to respect rules, the man who thought his service entitled him to disregard community standards. One evening, when the unease had grown too heavy to ignore, Daniel reached out to John Mercer, the retired architect who lived a few houses down, a widower who rarely spoke but whose quiet demeanor carried an air of dignity, as if years of building had given him an instinctive respect for permanence. Daniel invited him over, spreading the disputed documents across the kitchen table while the sound of cicadas swelled outside. John adjusted his glasses, leaning over the papers with a meticulous eye, tracing his finger along the signature line of the so-called compliance report, pausing at the date that had troubled Daniel. After several minutes of silence, he said, almost to himself, that the ink looked darker than the rest of the text, as if it had been laid on at a different time, and he pointed out that the typeface used in the header did not match the associations. Earlier templates, small details that most people would never notice but that to an architect accustomed to reading contracts and blueprints were glaring inconsistencies. He looked at Daniel and asked whether the inspector whose name appeared on the signature line had not retired months earlier, and when Daniel confirmed it, John leaned back, exhaling slowly, and said that in his professional opinion the document had been altered, if not outright forged. That revelation should have been liberating, but instead it deepened the unease, because proving forgery was not the same as suspecting it, and Daniel knew that in any courtroom the HOA would present its stamped papers with the full weight of procedure while he would stand there with suspicions and interpretations. He decided to dig deeper, spending hours at night combing through county records, cross-referencing building permits and past approvals, until he noticed a troubling pattern. Other homeowners in the neighborhood had been cited for violations that seemed just as questionable. Small modifications like porch extensions or decorative additions that had suddenly been deemed non-compliant after years of standing untouched. In several cases, the properties had eventually been sold at reduced value, and the buyers, according to county filings, were holding companies linked indirectly to Mason Holt's brother-in-law, a real estate developer with a history of flipping properties for profit. The implication was unsettling. The HOA was not simply enforcing rules, it was manufacturing violations in order to depress property values and funnel homes into the hands of insiders. The paranoia that grew from these discoveries was not irrational, and Daniel felt it in the pit of his stomach each time he noticed a car idling too long at the corner of his street, or when he found footprints in the damp earth near the side of his porch where no one should have been walking. One night he woke to the faint sound of metal scraping against wood, rushed outside with a flashlight and found nothing except the impression of a ladder in the soil, as if someone had propped it against the porch only to retreat into the darkness. When interrupted, he stood in the cool night air, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand, and the memory of nights overseas returned, when unseen eyes tracked his every movement and silence could mean danger. It was not simply the threat of losing the porch that unsettled him now, it was the realization that someone was actively tampering with his life, erasing his security piece by piece. Determined not to be passive, Daniel visited the county archives again, requesting access to original documents regarding his property. But the clerk at the desk, a man with tired eyes and a rehearsed tone, told him that the files had been temporarily withdrawn for review, a term so vague it meant nothing yet carried the weight of finality. When Daniel pressed, asking who had authorized the withdrawal, the clerk hesitated, glancing around the office before saying softly that the request had come from a legal representative of the HOA. The words struck Daniel like a physical blow, because it meant that Holt's reach extended into county bureaucracy, and that the very records that could have defended him were being sealed or altered under the guise of administrative procedure. He left the building with the sickening awareness that this was not simply a neighborhood dispute, but a coordinated effort to strip him of the one piece of permanence he had managed to construct. That evening John returned, carrying with him an old folder from his late wife's files, explaining that she had once worked in the planning office and had kept copies of certain neighborhood blueprints. Inside was a faded plan of Daniel's Street, drafted decades earlier when the development was first approved, and there, clearly marked on his lot, was an annotation indicating a porch extension as part of the original design standard, not a deviation from it. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed, but it was authentic, and for the first time Daniel felt a glimmer of hope that he had uncovered a weapon stronger than forged compliance reports. Yet, even as he held the fragile document in his hands, he knew it was dangerous, because whoever had gone to such lengths to erase his approvals would not hesitate to destroy or discredit this as well, if they learned of its existence. As the night deepened and John left, Daniel remained on the porch, staring out into the darkness that cloaked the street. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of rain, and in the silence he could almost hear the weight of the battle ahead pressing against the wooden boards beneath his feet. He realized then that this was no longer about the porch alone, not even about his own rights as a homeowner, but about a deeper corruption woven into the very fabric of the neighborhood, a corruption that used bylaws and stamped papers as weapons. His years of service had taught him that once corruption was exposed, it fought back with greater ferocity, and as he sat in the dim light of his porch, he understood that what lay ahead would test not only his resolve, but his willingness to confront. The kind of enemies who wore suits instead of uniforms. Enemies who thrived in silence and shadows. For the first time since the letter arrived, he smiled grimly, because if they thought they could erase him quietly, they had underestimated the man who had built this porch with hands that had carried him through war. The days that followed the discovery of the original blueprint were marked by a shift in the conflict that Daniel could feel even before anything concrete happened. A tightening of the atmosphere in the neighborhood, a sense that the board and its president had realized he would not be cowed into quiet submission and had therefore chosen to escalate the war into something more direct and more ruthless. It began with a new letter, thicker than the first, delivered not through the mailbox but slipped under his door as though whoever placed it there wanted him to know they could cross the threshold of his property at will. Inside was an emergency notice declaring that his porch had been evaluated by the HOA's structural committee and found to be unsafe, a hazard to the community, and therefore subject to immediate removal by contractors authorized by the board. The language was blunt and stripped of the legalistic flourishes of the first notice, and the date stamped at the bottom made clear that the demolition could proceed within 72 hours. Daniel stared at the paper in disbelief, his hands tightening around the edges until the fibers creased, because not only had there been no inspection, but the very idea of the HOA employing structural experts was absurd. The only engineer who had evaluated the porch had been county certified and had approved it without hesitation. That same afternoon, he noticed a pair of men walking slowly along the sidewalk in front of his house, carrying clipboards, measuring the distance from the curb to his porch as if preparing a survey. They did not acknowledge him when he stepped onto the porch, simply scribbled notes and moved on, their silence more unnerving than any confrontation. and when he attempted to follow them down the block, they disappeared into a waiting SUV that pulled away before he could record the license plate. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, he saw fresh chalk markings on the asphalt near his driveway, crude lines with arrows pointing toward his property, the kind utility companies used before excavation. It was a clear message. Preparations were being made, not through open dialogue but through intimidation, as though the street itself were being measured for his erasure. The neighbors, too, seemed to be pulled into the drama, though whether by manipulation or genuine belief, Daniel could not tell. Mrs. Walker from across the street, usually polite if distant, approached him one morning while he was sweeping leaves from the porch and suggested in a tight, rehearsed tone that perhaps he should let it go for the good of the community. Her words were not her own. He could see the shadow of Mason Holt in the way she phrased them, a mixture of condescension and veiled threat. Another neighbor, a younger man with a realtor's sign staked in his yard, muttered audibly about how Daniel's illegal porch was dragging down property values, though his eyes flicked nervously away when Daniel met them. The isolation was palpable, and it reminded Daniel of the early stages of psychological warfare, where the enemy worked not through open attack but through subtle erosion of trust and belonging, leaving the target surrounded and weakened. The pressure mounted when Daniel attempted once again to access his property records at the county office, only to be told this time that not only were the files under review, but that his own identification needed to be verified due to discrepancies. The clerk, clearly uncomfortable, showed him a copy of a form supposedly signed by him months earlier, requesting alterations to his property description, a form that bore his name but not his handwriting. For a long moment, Daniel could only stare at the page, the forged signature curling across the bottom like a taunt, and the realization that someone had gone so far as to impersonate him struck deeper than the violation of any bylaw. Because it was no longer about a porch or even a house, it was about erasing his legitimacy as a property owner altogether. He left the office shaken, clutching the photocopy of the fraudulent form, a fresh determination hardening in his chest, because this was evidence not just of incompetence, but of criminal intent. That night he sat with John Mercer again, the blueprint spread on the table beside the forged request, and the older man shook his head slowly, saying that the situation had grown more dangerous than he had expected, because if they were willing to fabricate ownership documents, then the next step would be to create a narrative in which Daniel himself was painted as unstable or untrustworthy. The words lingered in Daniel's mind long after John left, and they seemed prophetic when the next morning he found a note taped to his front door, unsigned but written in the same clipped style as HOA correspondence, warning him that continued resistance would result not only in financial penalties, but in a review of your fitness to reside in this community. The phrasing was chilling in its vagueness, as though the board intended to question not only his right to the porch, but his right to live there at all. The escalation reached its most brazen point 2 days later when Daniel returned from a supply run to find a pair of workers in reflective vests unloading tools from a truck in front of his house. They claimed to have orders to begin dismantling the porch immediately under the authority of the HOA. Daniel demanded to see the paperwork, and when they produced a flimsy copy of the emergency notice he had already received, he realized that the bluff had reached the stage of physical intrusion. His voice rose as he ordered them off his property, and though they hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to resistance, they eventually retreated, muttering that they would report back. The sight of the truck pulling away left Daniel with a mixture of relief and dread, because though he had stopped them this time, he knew they would return, perhaps with greater numbers or even law enforcement backing them under the pretense of community safety. As night fell and he sat once more on the porch that had become the center of his existence, Daniel felt the boards beneath him vibrate not with the weight of his body, but with the invisible pressure of forces aligned against him. The chalk marks on the street, the forged documents, the silent neighbors, and the intruding workers all pointed toward a strategy that was less about rules and more about exhaustion, to drive him into surrender by making every day a fresh battle. But as he looked out into the darkened street, the faint glow of distant porch lights flickering like watchfires, he understood with a clarity sharpened by years of conflict that surrender was no longer an option, because to give up the porch would be to accept erasure, and to accept erasure would be to betray not only himself but the years of service and the fragile stability he had fought to build. The escalation had become undeniable, and the war for his home had only just begun. The courtroom was colder than Daniel expected, the kind of sterile chill that seemed designed to strip emotion from the proceedings. Yet, as he sat at the long wooden table with his documents stacked neatly before him, he felt heat rising in his chest, a tension that had been building for weeks and that now threatened to spill over as he glanced across the aisle at Mason Holt, immaculate in his tailored suit, flanked by two attorneys whose briefcases gleamed like polished weapons. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority without raising in volume, entered, and the room rose before settling again. And in that moment Daniel realized that everything, the porch, the forged documents, the intimidation, would now be distilled into the words spoken within these four walls. The HOA attorneys began with the confidence of men who believed the law itself bent to their will, presenting their case with a stack of papers they claimed proved Daniel's porch had never been authorized, that he had bypassed community procedures, and that the board had acted only to protect property values and the safety of the neighborhood. They spoke of bylaws, citing page after page, weaving a narrative in which Daniel appeared reckless, arrogant, and dismissive of the rules everyone else abided by. Mason sat with a faint smile tugging at his lips, nodding occasionally as though the outcome were already assured, his gaze sliding toward Daniel with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had cornered his opponent completely. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel stood slowly, the weight of the folder in his hands grounding him, and began not with anger, but with precision. He laid out the county permits one by one, pointing to official signatures, to the inspector's approval, to the stamped authorization of the federal Veterans Grant Program that had funded the porch. He described the process of applying for the grant, the inspections carried out, the payments disbursed only after compliance was verified, and he held up the certificate that bore the seal of the program, a seal no HOA had the authority to override. He watched the judge's eyes narrow as she examined the document, her pen tapping lightly against her notebook. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel felt that his voice was not echoing into a void. Then came the moment he had prepared for but dreaded, the confrontation with the forged documents. The HOA's attorneys produced the compliance report they had waved like a banner in the earlier meetings, insisting it bore the signature of the inspector who had refused approval. Daniel requested that the page be examined by a handwriting specialist, and when the judge allowed it, the expert stepped forward, pointing out the inconsistencies Daniel and John Mercer had identified weeks earlier. The ink that did not match, the signature dated months after the inspector's retirement, the header format inconsistent with official templates used at the time. The expert's conclusion was blunt. The document was a forgery. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom carried the weight of disbelief and recognition, and Daniel turned his gaze toward Mason, whose smile had finally cracked, his jaw tightening as though he had been caught off guard for the first time. But Daniel was not finished. From his folder he produced the faded blueprint John had given him, the original plan of the neighborhood drafted decades earlier, clearly showing the porch extension marked as a design element for his lot. Though fragile and yellowed with age, the authenticity was undeniable, and when placed beside the fraudulent compliance report, it painted a picture not of oversight, but of deliberate manipulation. Daniel spoke slowly, his voice steady, explaining how the HOA had not only attempted to erase his right to the porch, but had sought to intimidate him, to isolate him from his neighbors, and to fabricate documents in order to achieve a financial, advantage for insiders connected to property acquisitions. He recounted the sudden chalk markings on the street, the workers who had arrived unannounced to dismantle the porch, and the forged request filed under his name at the county office, holding up the photocopy as evidence that someone had gone so far as to impersonate him in official records. By the time he finished, the room was silent, the attorneys shifting uncomfortably in their seats, Mason's composure slipping further with each passing moment. The judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable, and asked a simple question of the HOA attorneys. How did they explain the discrepancies, the forgery, the fraudulent request filed under Daniel's name? The silence that followed was damning, broken only by hollow attempts at deflection, claims of clerical error, suggestions that perhaps third parties had mishandled paperwork. But the weight of the evidence was too heavy, the chain of coincidences too precise, and as the judge's voice filled the room again, clear and final, she declared that the HOA had acted unlawfully, that the porch was legally constructed, and that attempts to force its removal were void. Furthermore, she ordered a review of the HOA's practices and referred the evidence of forged documents to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation. Daniel sat down slowly, the tension draining from his body like water from a cracked vessel, and though he kept his face composed, inside he felt the raw surge of vindication that comes only when a long battle has finally reached its turning point. He glanced across the aisle once more, and this time Mason was not smiling. His shoulders were rigid, his eyes locked on the table before him. A man who had relied on shadows and bureaucracy suddenly dragged into the light. The porch had survived, but more than that, the truth had been laid bare for all to see, and for the first time Daniel allowed himself to believe that the war was not only winnable, but nearly won. When the ruling was entered into record and the courtroom slowly emptied, Daniel felt the weight of weeks of pressure begin to shift, not disappear entirely, but lift just enough for him to breathe without the constant tightness that had clung to his chest since the first notice arrived. The porch, still standing as it always had, now carried with it the authority of the law, not just the strength of its beams and the permanence of its wood, but the undeniable acknowledgement that what he had built was his to keep, that the attempts to erase it had failed. In the days that followed, neighbors who had once looked away began to nod again, some offering halting words of apology, others admitting in hushed tones that they had always suspected the board was corrupt but had been too afraid to speak. It was not absolution, nor did Daniel expect it, but it was a sign that the tide of silence had turned, that the fear Mason Holt had wielded like a weapon was no longer absolute. The HOA, stripped of its authority by the judge's order and facing an investigation that reached far beyond Daniel's property, fell into disarray, and within weeks Holt resigned, his departure as quiet as his dominance had once been loud. The chalk markings on the street faded with rain. The SUV stopped appearing at the corners, and the mailbox, once a source of dread, returned to being nothing more than a place for bills and catalogs. For Daniel, the victory was not in humiliating Holt or even in the exposure of the forged documents, though both carried their own satisfaction, but in the simple act of sitting once more on his porch in the fading light of evening, the boards solid, beneath him the railing warm under his hand, and knowing that it remained not because he had hidden or yielded, but because he had stood and fought. The plaque at the base of the beam, the emblem of the veteran's grant, glinted faintly in the sunset, and for the first time it felt not just like recognition of service but proof that he had carried the discipline and resolve of those years into civilian life. As the neighborhood settled into its new rhythm, Daniel did not seek leadership, yet the community, fractured by fear and secrecy, began to look to him as a reminder that rules were meant to serve people, not suffocate them, and that silence only allowed corruption to deepen. He accepted this quietly, not with speeches or committees, but by continuing to sit on his porch, a steady presence that said more than words could. The battle had scarred him in ways he did not show, leaving him wary of papers, signatures, and official stamps, but it had also given him a renewed certainty that peace was not something handed down, but something defended, whether in distant lands, or on the threshold of a home built with care and earned with sacrifice. And as night fell once again, the cicadas humming in the dark and the porch light casting a warm circle around him, Daniel Reeves allowed himself, finally, to feel not only relief but a quiet pride, because he had faced a war that came to his doorstep and had refused to be erased.